So maybe we can start with the audience here. If there are any questions that you would like to ask, I think one of our colleagues will be around with a microphone.
Translations from the Sanskrit by Bourneuf and Kern. Marche-pied means a step. It's not a, I don't know what footbank would be, but it looks oddly as though Kern was translating Bourneuf because of this. So I wondered what the Sanskrit says.
It says a footstool. Whether it's a step to reach the seat or whether it's a footstool in the sense of something to rest your feet on while you're sitting is not altogether clear. Yeah. But footstool would be the I think the best translation, right? So that means something to rest your feet on. But you're quite right, and this is very common that once a text is translated, then the first translation becomes very generative for all the succeeding ones, often in ways that perpetuate error. But we can see this in the Chinese tradition as well. There's no doubt that Kumarajiva looked at Dhammaraksha's translation, and I've done some work on this and seen how the wording of the first translation is perpetuated through the succeeding ones.
Thank you very much.
So I have a question for Dr. Chung. My name is Tian Mengqiu. I come from Heidelberg University, and Buddhist art also interests me very well. And so, first of all, thank you for your interesting topic. And my question is, the gilt bronze statue you showed us with its reverse side depicting two Buddhas sitting side by side, and first the preach and then the birth of Buddha. I think this combination is very rare because the two Buddhas sitting side by side is a very important part from the Lotus Sutra, and the other things are from Buddha's life. So how do we understand this kind of combination? And do you have you ever seen any other similar kind of representation?
Academia Sinica, there is a similar arrangement. Yeah. So in the upper side of the back of the stair and the upper side, yeah. It's popular in northern Beizhou, the northern dynasties. There is a similar arrangement. Yeah.
It's normal to see the scene from the Lotus Sutra combined with the representation of Buddha's life.
Yeah. Buddha's. Oh, okay.
Because we usually have, for example, 4 great events of Buddha's life together. We can see this kind of representation from India. But now we have Buddha's life combined with things from Lotus Sutra. So I think it's not very often.
Okay.
Or do you know any other similar kind of representations?
No, I have no idea about. Yeah. Buddhas. Because the front, we could identify it the Buddha preaching the law. So it's also the life. But if you mentioned the birth of the Buddha is the only one example, actually. Yeah.
So you mean this is the only one example, or there are also some other kind of this kind of representation?
Oh, pardon?
So this is the only one example of this kind with two Buddhas sitting side by side, followed by representations of Buddha's life, or there are also some other kind of similar kind of representations?
If 好，你帮我确认一下。
就是说还有没有类似这样的例子？
我知道，你是说那个前面？
就是它的那个背光上面。对，就是
跟那个佛传合在一起嘛？
对。
这个因为我刚这个就是二佛并坐在背光后面，在北朝很常见。但是如果跟佛传诞生，this is the only one example.
Okay, thank you.
Should I quickly translate what? Okay, so what Dr. Chung just replied to the questions is it is quite unique that the two Buddhas seated together above and combined together with the Buddha story of the Buddha's life is quite unique, and this is possibly the one we can see in the collections. Any questions?
I think there was another question here. Yeah.
Mr. Chung, I just wanted to give you an information. As Professor Teiser has shown in his keynote speech, the first, the frontispiece, there is Korea, and as you know, and when I wrote my first article on Korea Illuminated Sutras in 1987, as all people are quoting, but perhaps you haven't seen it. There, I mentioned very clearly, and researching Korean historical materials, that Imperial Yuan court requested to send Korea illuminators and writers to China, so Yuan China. So what you have shown, 1330 dated one, is quite possible with the Chinese name, but also Korean, Korea writers and monks and so forth. So it was during the Mongol occupation, so Korea had to apply or follow the request what the Yuan Imperial Court asked. So there are, I think, more Lotus Sutra existing in all East Asian countries, I mean China, Korea, and Japan. The Lotus Sutra was one of the most important and frequently depicted and written manuscript. So there are numerous other examples surviving 13th and 14th century Korea Lotus Sutra manuscript in Japanese collections and in Korea, and then perhaps one or two in Taipei. I have seen that 1330 dated that Lotus Sutra when I was writing and researching that. And as far as I know, there is only one, the Lotus Sutra, Korea Lotus Sutra, in the West, in the Metropolitan Museum. And this material is very important to study, to research the importance of the position the Lotus Sutra occupied in East Asian Buddhism and Buddhist communities. Thank you.
Actually, we find the name in the back of our the manuscript in our collection, but I still can't find any information about the writer.
Yeah, okay. there any other questions? There are.
My own. A request, a comment, and a question. The request is, Professor Harrison, please do translate the text. The comment bit is just adding to why that's so important, because even just recently I was looking at versions of the thing, and there are doctrinal features that you've got in Dhammaraksha, that you've got in Sanskrit Witnesses as far as I can see, that you've got in the Tibetan, but that are different in Kumarajiva, where that's the outlier. And this feeds back into the field as well, because, so I'm getting some feedback on this, but there are so many things that are read in these good translations of Kumarajiva's Chinese that are then read by Indologists that then talk about the thing in India, and there are subtle but important things that get elided there that are interesting. But a question, which is that behind all of this, I'm wondering about Dhammaraksha, and I think I maybe know the answer to this, but so much of this and the reproduction of the text and so on is Kumarajiva's version in China. Is there any afterlife to Dhammaraksha? Once Kumarajiva's text is on the scene, does anyone ever copy his text? Is there anything that's ever done with that ever again? And I wonder whether within Dunhuang manuscripts or anywhere else we see an afterlife to that earlier version of the text, or whether it's simply there in the canon, but it's Kumarajiva's that lives on. And that's an open question.
Right. I'm not sure I can answer this, and maybe Professor Teiser can. My understanding, but my memory is rather vague on it, is that some of the other translations are copied at Dunhuang, but their number is extremely small. But I think it is represented. But you're right, Kumarajiva seems to obliterate all the opposition. Even the translation of Xuanzang, which are usually much closer to the Sanskrit text as we have it. And you're also quite right, a lot of information gets lost in his version because he had a particular way of approaching his job, which was sometimes to turn it in particular. I mean, I've noticed this with my work on the Vajrachaitaka, on the Diamond Sutra. But I think it would be very nice to have an English translation of Dhammaraksha. My brief encounters with the text have convinced me that this would be a job for somebody very brave, because it's often not easy to understand. And that's another advantage that Kumarajiva has. He's very easy to read. But you're quite right. Yep. As for the request, well, we'll see about that.
Just to reinforce some of the comments made by Paul Harrison, and to further them, Melody Dumi just raised her finger one. There's one copy of the Dhammaraksha translation among the Dunhuang manuscripts in the Stein collection. There are two. They're easy to find in the Stein catalog because he's renumbered it in the Giles catalog because he puts them all together. And there are 1,000 some odd by Kumarajiva, and then there are 1 or 2 by Dhammaraksha, and there are 2 or 3 of the later translation by Anjanagupta and Dharmagupta. But as to why is Kumarajiva so widely represented is a really important big question, both for modern times, as Professor Harrison noted, as well as for back then, and a lot of it has to do with the language. The language of Kumarajiva became the church language of Chinese Buddhism. And it's still, I think it's being studied closely by linguists now more than ever, but really deserves even further scrutiny as to why that 4-character phrasing in particular that was so popular in the Yao Qin dynasty, why did that become popular? It wasn't that popular before, and then it became popular, and it now seemed for so many centuries so appealing to so many readers in Chinese. That's the one that's copied. That's the one that becomes the standard of all the other texts. The other 2 versions were in the canon, but they were canonical. But it's Kumarajiva's version that remains the most popular.
Thank you. I will go to a question from the audience online, and this is for Professor Teiser from Ruifeng Cheng, who is asking, I'm wondering why Dunhuang means to read aloud. How do we know it was aloud?
It's a good question, and it can be read with many different meanings, such that in Zhuan is the Chinese, as a single Chinese character, simply means to turn, literally, but it can mean to turn like a bookshelf. It can mean to turn the scrolls as one reads in a scroll composition, but it is used then as a metaphor for the activity of reading. And was reading always done aloud? No, not always, but it often was, and zhuan du as a compound word with zhuan together with du was often used in the sense of reading aloud. So it's on that basis that I hypothesize that when that word occurs just once in the colophon I cited, I interpret it as to read aloud once. He could have done it silently, but he probably did it aloud.
Okay, many thanks. There is another question which is not directed to a speaker specifically, from David Weber, who asks, what are the distinct characteristics that would amount to 4 Lotus Sutra branches rather than 3?
I think that question is for me. Well, there are just 4 origin sites. There could be 5. Actually, that number could be 5 if we count the manuscripts in the People's Republic of China, which are usually lumped together with the Nepalese manuscripts. So it's just a question of sites of origin. As to whether you can really distinguish recensions, it's been standard to talk about the Gilgit Nepalese. That's before we had the Bamiyan materials, and the Central Asian as 2 separate recensions. So we've gone from 2, but in fact, it's doubtful whether that makes a lot of sense, because when you add the Bamiyan manuscripts into the mix, you see that sometimes they agree with the Central Asian against Gilgit and Nepal. Sometimes they agree with the Gilgit Nepalese. Sometimes they agree with Gilgit, but not with the Nepalese. So the whole picture starts to unravel. And so it's rather arbitrary how many different strands you talk about.
Okay, and then we have the question here.
I think another one for Professor Harrison. With the Prakrit version that you were talking about being the apparently earliest and so on, and the work that's been done on Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, do we now think that we have an out of India origin for the Lotus Sutra, even the Prakrit version?
Yeah, I would be cautious about how I answered that question, because I think it's perfectly possible that some Sanskrit texts, or some texts which are now Sanskrit, were first composed in Central Asia. And I think too often we work with the sort of China-India binary and elide the contributions of what was going on between, particularly Khotan. We have not yet found, and this is what we have to remember, and that's why I'm cautious, the picture could change overnight with the discovery of a Gandhari fragment of the text. And we haven't yet found one, but that's not to say that we won't find one next year or the year after. And then it's a different ball game as far as calculating the date of composition and so on. So our picture of how Buddhist texts were composed and where they were composed, It's changing all the time. But I think for the time being, I'm happy to sort of postulate an Indian composition for the text rather than a Central Asian one, unless there are indications to the contrary.
Okay, so maybe here. Okay, question here at the front.
Thank you, and I have a question for Guangshan Master, and I'm very inspired by your presentation. As I know, the Lotus Sutra is the king of sutra, 经中之王. So I'm very interested when you practice in the For Guangshan, because you have audience from foreigner and Chinese. Are you chanting in Chinese or the Teiser? Because I can see it's really complicated, and I like this sutra because it has a lot of beautiful stories. Even children, they said 三界如火宅. You can use the imagination, thinking what happened there. So I want to know what real reality you practice.
You mean how do we chant? Do you mean that?
And how you inspire the passion, compare this practice and with the real, very difficult theory. Yeah, they have a lot of metaphor. I read these sutras and I found it's beautiful, and the language is beautiful. I read in Chinese, and then today I feel very interesting. I know it can translate it so beautiful in another language.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, actually, about the translation of Kimarajuva is very beautiful in Chinese, and in our temple, we have the headquarters of For Guangshan Europe is actually in Paris. We chant the Lotus Sutra every day, every morning. So we do chant in Chinese, and it's the rhythm is really free way to chant. So everyone will chant according to their own breath. So then it's just look like a wave to chant the sutra. And we not only chant the sutra, we also give class and then explain more about the doctrine, because actually from so many different ways to explain this sutra, a way to explain word by word is also a way to translate, to give the talk, to give the class. So then basically we do have chant the sutra, and then this year is actually the 30th years of For Guangshan in Europe. So then our temple, London For Guangshan Temple, we do have a copy of the sutra. It's more than how many copies? 37 copies of the sutra. So then, 4 in English, yes. So then, all venerables and devotees, we do the copy. So then altogether, it's more than 41 copy of the Lotus Sutra. Yes. So that's how we practice. We practice that actually every day. Yes.
Thank you. I think we are almost there in terms of time, but maybe there is space for another question. I'm picking up one from the online chat. This is a question from Adam and Clark for Professor Teiser. And it says, thank you for this interesting beginning. I wondered if you had any brief comments regarding the content of the additional 30th chapter regarding Ashvaghosha Bodhisattva.
I have not read the whole, it's a good question. I have not read the whole thing. The parts of it that I've read is similar to the 29th chapter, so it doesn't seem to be about Ma Ming Pusa himself. Perhaps it was attributed to him, but it follows a similar cosmological framing as the 29th chapter, which is also framed along the lines of cosmology. So if you know Buddhist cosmology from the Qi Shi Jing or the Dirgha Agama, which is Taisho number 1, you will see a very similar cosmology, and that's presented, and then the Lotus Sutra practice is placed within that framework.
Thank you. If you all agree, I would say this is a very good place where to end, and so it remains to me really to thank all the speakers of today's session, Professor Teiser, Professor Harrison, Venerable Miao Duo, and Roxanna Pang, and Tzu-yin Chung. Thank you very much for a wonderful start of the conference and for your very enlightening and inspiring contributions. Thanks a lot, and we will continue tomorrow.